In 1990, a coalition of 35 nations went to war over the invasion and occupation of Kuwait by Iraq. The Gulf War was a war of modern technologies that tested and sometimes debuted some of the most cutting-edge technologies of modern warfare. Things like stealth aircraft and laser-guided smart bombs, hyper-accurate radar, air, and ground surveillance systems, advanced infrared imaging systems that required no light source at all, out of line of sight satellite communications, remote aerial vehicles, and all sorts of technologies defined the war that became called the video game war. But in this war of new technologies, there were some venerable weapon systems that many thought were past their prime, maybe even past their time, that still showed their worth. Two veterans of wars long past lent their mighty voices, which had not been heard in combat for decades, to the Gulf War, leading to a startling first and a nostalgic finale for warfare. The end of the era of the battleship is history that deserves to be remembered. The era of the battleship was already waning by the time the battleships of the Iowa class were commissioned. The class of fast battleships was originally envisioned as a group that was heavy enough to participate in the battle line, but fast enough to protect supply lines. They were a response to fast battleships, especially the Congo class of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which it was feared could attack the Navy along its lines of supply, outgun protective cruisers, and yet be too fast for slower battleships of the line to bring to battle. As designed, the ships of the Iowa class could make 33 knots and had a main armament of 9 16-inch 50 caliber guns, more powerful than the 16-inch 45 caliber guns used on the preceding South Dakota and North Carolina classes, whose barrels were 80 inches shorter. 887 feet long, with a displacement of 57,540 long tons fully loaded, their superstructure stood 15 stories high. They were the largest battleship ever built by the United States, 207 feet longer than the South Dakota class, yet still having a beam of 108 feet, narrow enough to traverse the Panama Canal. By the time the first ship of the class, the USS Iowa, BB-61, was commissioned in February of 1943, the idea of fast battleships had already changed. Although there were a few battleship versus battleship encounters of the war, it was already obvious that naval combat was no longer defined by a battle line of heavy battleships, but that the future was in naval aviation, where great fleet battles would occur without the ships ever coming within sight of each other. While battleships still played an important role in fire support, their fleet role had changed to escorting the new, fast Essex-class aircraft carriers. 4 ships of the Iowa class were initially envisioned. Later, an additional 2 battleships, originally intended to be built as the heavier Montana class, were assigned to be built to the Iowa design. Iowa was commissioned in February of 1943 and New Jersey the following May. The next 2, Missouri and Wisconsin, were both ordered in June of 1940 and laid down in January of 1941. Wisconsin launched on December 7, 1943, 2 years to the day after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. The final 2, Illinois and Kentucky, were still under construction at the end of the war and were never completed, making the Missouri and Wisconsin the last U.S. battleships ever built. They weren't the last battleship ever built. HMS Vanguard of the Royal Navy was commissioned in 1946 and never saw combat. But they were among the last of the ships that had once defined the Navy's prestige, but had been displaced by new technology. The Iowa-class battleships saw combat throughout the Pacific campaigns, defending the fleet against air attacks and using their massive guns to support troops landing on enemy beaches. On September 2nd, 1945, Missouri, by then affectionately nicknamed the Mighty Mo, was the location of the ceremony where representatives of the Empire of Japan signed the Japanese Instrument of Surrender, officially marking the end of hostilities of the Second World War. Iowa was also in the bay that day. 3 days later, Wisconsin, called the Whiskey, entered Tokyo Harbor, part of the occupying force. New Jersey, the Big J, arrived on the 17th and served as the flagship of the naval forces in Japanese waters. Among them, the Iowa-class battleships earned 26 battle stars during their relatively brief service in World War II. After the war, there was disagreement as to the need to maintain battleships. All of the classes of battleships prior to the Iowa class were too slow to keep up with the fleet carriers, now the centerpiece of the Navy. While they had some post-war duties, transporting troops or as training ships, by 1947 all had been decommissioned, placed in reserve fleets, scrapped, or used in testing nuclear weapons. In 1947, Iowa was part of a group assigned to sink the decommissioned USS Nevada, which had been sunk at Pearl Harbor, refloated, participated in the D-Day landings, and then survived not one, but 2 nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. But even the Iowa class, the most modern battleships in the Navy, proved just too expensive to keep in service. By 1948, all but the Missouri had been placed into the reserve fleets. Reserve fleets are often called mothball fleets. They're places where ships are kept maintained enough to stay afloat in case they need to be recommissioned in time of emergency. But in practice, very few ships in history have ever been recommissioned after being placed in mothballs. As Congress and military planners discussed possible roles and conversions for the remaining battleships, Missouri was the only commissioned U.S. battleship after 1948. Some argue because President Truman had a soft spot for the ship, which had been christened by his daughter, Margaret. But the Second World War had given way to the Cold War, and perhaps the largest proxy war of the Cold War started in June of 1950, when troops from North Korea crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. The South Korean army, poorly equipped and caught by surprise, was decimated in a matter of days. The U.S. military had been greatly reduced following the end of the Second World War, but was deploying the first troops to assist South Korea before the end of June. In addition to land and air units, the U.S. deployed a significant fleet to support UN forces defending South Korea. Among them was the nation's last battleship, USS Missouri, arrived in September. Missouri's 16-inch guns played critical roles in supporting the landings at Incheon that turned the tide of the war, and in the following December in covering the retreat of UN forces, as the intervention by the People's Republic of China turned the tide yet again. In November, New Jersey was reactivated, and Wisconsin and Iowa returned to service in 1951. Iowa engaged in so many fire support missions in Korea that she earned the nickname the Gray Ghost. The ships of the Iowa class continued to rotate through service in the conflict until the end of hostilities in 1953. New Jersey earned 4 battle stars for the Korean conflict. Missouri earned 3, Iowa 2, and Wisconsin earned 1. While their fire support capabilities with their massive 16-inch guns were impressive, the enemy simply learned to not put important targets that close to shore. Heavy cruisers proved to be almost as effective at shore bombardment and were far less expensive to operate. Despite their distinguished service during the war, the Korean conflict left the Navy less convinced than ever that it was worthwhile to maintain the high cost of operating battleships. By 1958, all 4 of the Iowa-class battleships were back in mothballs. There was a noteworthy incident in this period. In May 1956, the Wisconsin collided with the Fletcher-class destroyer USS Eaton in heavy fog off the Virginia Capes. Both ships were damaged severely. The Eaton's keel was broken, and the bow was only saved by securing an anchor chain bow to stern. Wisconsin took significant damage to her bow, leaving the question whether the ship should be maintained. However, the hulk USS Kentucky, the Iowa-class battleship that had never been finished, was kept as a parts hulk. Kentucky's bow was removed whole and used to replace Whiskey's damaged bow. At this point, it seemed like the argument had turned against the costly battleships. By 1962, all of the remaining battleships, except for the 4 Iowa-class, had been removed from the reserve fleets. Most had been scrapped, while a handful were given to various organizations as museum ships. In 1968, the Navy briefly reactivated the New Jersey, which of the Iowa class had had the most recent refit to use in the Vietnam conflict. By then, New Jersey was the only active battleship left in the world. It was hoped that her heavy guns could replace some air missions, reducing the air losses in the conflict. The cost of maintaining the vessel and crew, however, proved prohibited. She served 1 tour and was deactivated again in 1969. But the day of the battleship had not ended. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and his platform included a significant increase in the size and capabilities of the U.S. Navy. This was part of a strategy that Reagan described as peace through strength, the idea of promoting peace via a strong deterrence and the underlying goal of winning the Cold War by bankrupting Moscow in an arms race. In 1980, the USSR commissioned the first Kirov-class nuclear-powered heavy missile cruiser. At 827 feet, the ships of the Kirov class were the size of World War I battleships and the largest surface combatant ships active in the world at the time, smaller only than large aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships. The administration, intent on bringing the U.S. fleet up to 600 ships, wanted a response. The decision was to modernize and reactivate the 4 Iowa-class battleships that had been in mothballs for nearly 30 years. The ship's engines were modified to use new fuel. Their electronics and anti-aircraft systems were replaced with modern electronic warfare suites and close-in weapon systems. They were modified to carry Harpoon and Tomahawk missile systems. They're equipped with the RQ-2 Pioneer unmanned aerial vehicle, acting as a spotter for their 16-inch guns, which, despite some discussion of replacing them, were retained. Their fire accuracy greatly enhanced with the modern Mark 160 fire control system. Despite their age, the refit was reasonably cost-effective, with the Navy spending a total of some $1.7 billion to bring the 4 ships back into service, roughly the cost of building 4 new Oliver Hazard Perry-class frigates. New Jersey's guns were fired as part of an intervention in the 1983 Lebanese Civil War. Iowa suffered a catastrophic turret explosion in its No. 2 turret in 1989. Despite sending some $25 million on 2 investigations, the cause of the explosion could not be definitely determined. 47 crew were killed, one of the most deadly events during peacetime in the history of the United States Navy. Iowa was again decommissioned December of 1990 and New Jersey in February 1991. But Missouri and Wisconsin had another war to fight. On August 2nd, 1990, the Iraqi army invaded and occupied the neighboring country of Kuwait. The move brought international condemnation and a coalition of nations to support the military response. The response included the world's last 2 active battleships. Missouri arrived in the Gulf first, making its first attacks with missiles on January 17th. On January 30th, for the first time since 1953 and more than 46 years after the ship had been commissioned, the 16-inch guns of USS Missouri were fired in anger, shelling a command and control bunker near the Saudi border. Wisconsin relieved Missouri in February, firing her guns in a fire support mission against Iraqi artillery, the first time that they had been used in combat since March of 1952. Later, in February, both ships participated in an important mission, simulating a planned amphibious assault. The fate tied up some 80,000 Iraqi troops. Assigned to bombard entrenched troops on Kuwait's Failaka Island after being pounded by Missouri's 16-inch guns, throwing 1,900-pound high-explosive shells, Wisconsin flew her unmanned aerial vehicle over the trenches, deliberately low, so that the Iraqi troops would know what was coming. Terrified of more bombardment by the massive battleships, Iraqi troops showed white flags to the tiny spotter vehicle. The first known time in war that enemy troops surrendered to an unmanned aircraft controlled by a ship. The company that built the aircraft described the event as the first electronic capture in history. Before the end of hostilities later that month, Missouri and Wisconsin each had fired more than 1 million pounds of ordnance on Iraqi targets. Their unmanned aerial vehicles had flown hundreds of hours of reconnaissance missions, and the battleships had also helped to clear naval mines. On February 23rd, the last day of hostilities, Wisconsin fired the last fire support mission of the Gulf War. It was the last time that a battleship's guns were fired in combat anywhere on Earth. The shots marked the end of the era of the battleship. Although they are no longer being maintained so that they could be brought into service, all 4 ships of the Iowa class have been preserved as museum ships. Over the course of their long careers, there was always a discussion about the cost of maintaining and crewing such large ships. Their successful deployment, nearly 50 years after they were launched, was a testament to the durability of their design. But things like missiles and aircraft and perhaps future weapons like railguns are thought now to be able to replace the fire support missions that were the last main role of the 16-inch guns of the Iowa class. And as time went on, it just became more and more expensive to try to maintain them or considering bringing them back into service. There were no longer crew or shipyards with experience in their maintenance or their operation. Still, the great battleships and their great guns were a sign of national prestige, and they were a terror that intimidated an enemy. The battleships of the Iowa class earned 47 battle stars among them, and it is difficult to imagine a United States Navy without them. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.